Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining this Launchpad event, Untapped Potential, the importance of African gene banks in ensuring food security across the continent. My name is Azur Lalani, the Outreach and Engagement Specialist for the Global Crop Diversity Trust, an international organization working to safeguard global crop diversity in perpetuity. I'm pleased to now begin the panel discussion. We're honored that Dr. Eliane Ubali-Joro, a professor at McGill University and executive board member for the Global Crop Diversity Trust, will moderate this discussion. Our expert panel speakers are Dr. Agnes Kalibata, the UN's Special Envoy for the 2021 Food Systems Summit and President of the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. Susan Bragdon, founder and director of Seeds for All and an international lawyer and policy advisor for Oxfam Novib. Dr. Damaris Odeni, a global cluster leader and finger millet expert for ICRISAT. And last but not least, Dr. Tony Simons, the executive director of C4ICRAF, an expert in agroforestry in Africa. If you have any questions during the discussion, please drop them in the chat, which our senior scientist and director of external affairs, Hanna Stempivov, will be moderating. If there are any questions to particular panelists, please also add them to the chat and we will get back to you with an answer. If you'd like to support efforts to conserve crop diversity in Africa and beyond, please visit our website, follow us on social media, or sign up for our newsletter. I'll add the links in the chat.
Hello, everyone. So today's focus is going to be on untapped potential, the importance of African gene banks in ensuring food security across the continent. So this specific GLF Launchpad event is to highlight the critical importance of gene banks in Africa, their role in ensuring food security globally, and the challenges they currently face. So COVID-19 has exposed how vulnerable and interconnected we are. Without international cooperation, effective safeguarding of plant genetic resources to secure the world's food supply is simply not possible. Gene banks are full of untapped potential in the incredible wealth of crop diversity they hold, and many are unable to live up to their promise due to an array of challenges, including being under-resourced. By making seeds available to breeders and farmers to develop and use crop varieties adapted to current and future climates, gene banks are fundamental in combating the effects of climate change and are critical to the importance for sustainable farming and the livelihoods of smallholder farmers. So we have an amazing panel today to discuss how using crop varieties that are rich, nutrient-rich, tolerant to environmental stresses like drought and extreme heat can be resistant to pests and diseases to help smallholder farmers. So I'm really delighted to have with us today Agnes Kalibata, Susan Bragdon, Damaris Odeni, and Tony Simons. So I would like to start with Agnes. So in terms of what roles do you see that gene banks play in ensuring food security in Africa and globally? Please unmute yourself. You're still muted.
Sorry. So thank you, Eliane, for that question, and really happy to be with a group of experts, really the best in the world in terms of talking about some of the genetic resources we have and how we can conserve them. So like you said earlier, gene banks are under-resourced, and yet they're so critical to where we are at now as a world, especially in Africa, because of three things that I see happen every day. Climate change is very quickly eroding our genetic potential on the ground. Infrastructure development is very quickly loading our genetic potential on the ground. And then, of course, our agricultural systems also are moving in a direction that is not very supportive of huge biodiversity on the ground. So the ability to have gene banks that allow us to harvest some of our best to ensure that when we need that fallback position, because again, as climate change comes, things could continue evolving, and some of the genes we have today may not perform as well tomorrow because of whatever stresses they'll be incurring tomorrow. So the ability to have a fallback position from a gene perspective is really the purpose of these gene banks. The ability to be able to reconstitute some of what we have today, but we are losing very fast, is extremely important. I mean, just one example. nutrition. I've seen a situation in my own country, Rwanda, where some of the very odd vegetables I grew up eating, which we thought were really horrible vegetables, but actually the taste was really the basis of their nutrition value. And we've lost those vegetables over time, 40% in calcium. And we've succumbed to some of the more popular vegetables that the market is driving. And Genebanks will help save some of these materials and ensure that they come back in real time to support what is going on.
Thank you, Agnes. That is really helpful in terms of giving us some background. So Damaris, in terms of what your work involves in, what actions do you see are needed to bridge the gap between Genebanks breeders and farmers?
Thank you for that question. So I have been privileged to work with material from the Genebank in a project that is on finger millet here in the region. And one of the things that we have learned is that working together with the Genebank, farmers, and the researchers was very, very helpful in helping the project succeed. And that was possible because we had a joint funding. That joint funding was provided through the Crop Trust, and we were able to implement jointly a project that was useful to the farmers and also to other breeders. Now, the way that we need to bridge continuously the connectivity between the Genebank, the breeders, and farmers is looking for joint funding. There are a lot of genetic material sitting in the Genebank that would help improve the livelihoods of farmers that without funding would never reach them. Yet they are so important in changing the livelihoods of farmers. At the same time, breeders keep recycling the same things over and over again. And in some crops, actually, you find that there are only a few lines, a few genotypes that are used over and over. And there's lacking important traits such as drought tolerance or disease resistance. And most of the times when you go back to the Genebank, you find some of these drought tolerant traits or resilience traits. And so by working together, getting joint funding and implementing projects together, you're able to bridge that gap, go back to the Genebank, look for all these wonderful traits, have access to the breeders so that they can utilize those resources to be able to improve what the farmers need. And at the end of the day, the farmers' lives will have been improved, and at the same time, we'll also have the biodiversity that we need, and also to be able to maintain the diversity that we need in the crops, in the fields of the farmers. Thank you.
Thank you, Damaris. That's really important information in terms of how do we really harness all the biodiversity available so we can really face climate change with all the amazing information available in our genetic resources and the Genebanks. So Susan, I wanted to ask you, why are policies to support smallholder farmers and agriculture biodiversity so important?
Thank you. That's a really important question. I think we need to first recognize that our food systems, all of them are embedded in a globalized system and in a globalized world. So there are a lot of pressures that are pushing us away from diversity on farm, which also makes ex situ collections all the more important as a complementary measure to support on-farm conservation. But I'm sitting in Mexico and I see a breeze that my computer flies off. I'll try to grab it. But I can give an example here in Mexico. When the North American Free Trade Agreement was signed in 1993, you had heavily subsidized products, food products coming into Mexico, and it displaced 2 million small-scale farmers here in Mexico. It also opened up the markets to foreign direct investment, 75% of which went to processed foods. And that the sales of processed foods it just increased rapidly. And that created an obesity and overweight crisis here in Mexico. And this is replicated with trade agreements elsewhere. So there also, I mean, it could be a very long answer to talk about all the policies that are there that can support and policies that don't support, from seed regulations to intellectual property rules. But we really do need to have policies that are really directed at supporting what smallholder farmers are doing in terms of innovating and conserving and developing agrobiodiversity on farm. And ex situ and gene banks are a really important part of that whole package.
Thank you, Susan. We'll have to go back on all the intellectual property and maybe talking some depth on the policies. That would be really helpful. So Tony, what do you see are the roles that gene banks play in mitigating future effects of climate change in Africa? Can you unmute yourself, please?
Gosh, after all of these time of Zoom calls, you'd think we would get that right. Anyway, thanks very much, Eliane. So the role of gene banks in climate change is fundamental in Africa, and as Agnes opened, reminding us of those three big challenges of climate, infrastructure, and changing needs in our food systems. So we need to modernize gene banks for climate change in Africa. We think of the gene bank as the physical infrastructure. And the big infrastructure programs in Africa that we saw post-independence are really iconic. But for the next generation and African youth, the infrastructure is going to be green. It's going to be natural. And there's a great opportunity for gene banks to be working with those farmers, with those groups, with civil society to make sure that we have that diversity. And Africa is blessed with diversity. How well that is conserved is less so. And it's great that Crop Trust is working with international gene banks as well as the national gene banks in the individual countries to strengthen that opportunity to not lose this wonderful treasure and diversity that we have. And with the decade on ecosystem restoration coming up, it's really important that we put gene banks at the front of that. And let's remember, Africa is not one ecosystem. Africa is not one group of agricultural species. It's that wonderful mixture of species that are underutilized and neglected, as well as those mainstream ones. It's not either or, it's both and together. And the African Orphan Crops Consortium that Damaris also works under with that support of many partners shows just how Africa is leading in highlighting and scheduling and training. This wonderful enterprise, the African Orphan Crops Consortium, is only 6 years old, and yet it's trained nearly 200 African mid-career plant breeders, given them the tools, the latest opportunities to express their abilities and the potential in their countries. An amazing 238 new breeding programs have come out from those gene banks. And that is to support the change in climate, the change in temperature, the change in rainfall, the change in extreme events that we're seeing. So, let's modernize gene banks in Africa. Let's, in the same way that telephony in the continent leapfrogged over copper telephone lines because we went straight to mobile phones, with gene banks, we can combine the physical gene bank with that natural, that green gene bank, and combine not only the intra-specific diversity that we've been looking at, but also that assemblage of interspecific diversity, as well as the ecosystems in which they're derived.
So I love that in terms of, how do we preserve the gene banks in those two ways, in terms of green gene bank and capacity to do work that really allows us to advance more climate resilience. So Damaris, I just wanted to go back to you in terms of your work. Could you just tell us a bit more in terms of the Cropwild Relatives Project, how this came about, and what have been the lessons learned so far?
Yeah, so the Cropwild Relatives Project, which has been implemented by the Crop Trust over the last several years, picked up on a number of crops that were either underutilized or were not optimally conserved, and looked for using wild relatives or land races to be able to improve the crops in question. The particular example that I worked with was finger millet, as I mentioned earlier. In this project, we were tasked with improving resilience in finger millet. Now, finger millet is relatively underutilized, relatively unknown crop, but with so much potential. It's highly nutritious, it's very resilient. But through the implementation of this project, we realized that we could significantly increase the resilience. We could increase drought tolerance. We could increase disease resistance, particularly a disease called blast. And we were also able to increase resistance to a parasitic weed called striga. Now, that experience also helped us to realize that finger millet, even though it originates from the East African region, it has not been conserved well. At the time that we started the project, we only had less than 3,000 accessions conserved in the region, in Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda combined, which is significantly less given the extent of diversity that you find here. And that was particularly concerning for us, the implementers of the project, because there are just so many things that are yet to be done with finger millet. And if just by doing a project in a few years, we were able to increase or we were able to identify all these unique traits, it is obvious that if we do not conserve what we see in the fields, then we are going to lose very, very precious diversity. And the other thing that was obvious to us was that the gene bank material that we have at the moment, even though it has been conserved and it is useful, it will need a lot of characterization, a lot of fine details to be done on it for it to be useful. We had to do a lot of cleanup with it initially to be able to pick out on the most useful material, and that just would require a lot more investment. But for sure, this is a very precious material that needs to be conserved a lot more, and especially in the region of diversity that it is. The other final thing that was also very interesting for us to learn was just the role of women in conservation, in utilization, and also in the processing of the crop. Now, finger millet in the region is actually more or less known as a woman's crop. And so if you go to the farmers' fields, you find mostly it's the women who are involved in the cultivation and in the collecting of the crop from the field, or if they see some unique material in the field, they will conserve it and use it for the next season. And that was so important because you could actually see that the reason why the nutrition bit of finger millet has been important, and in fact, in places such as in Kenya, if you asked anybody who uses finger millet why they use it, they will tell you it's because of its nutritional value. And this has been preserved because of the involvement of the women who are working with it. And so it is also one of the ways that we can actually reach out to women in terms of increasing their participation, not just in the utilization and in the cultivation, but also in the conservation. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. You mentioned striga, which is a parasitic crop that can really wipe out crops completely. And so the importance of having genetic material that allows resistance to striga is really important. And just to follow up, the importance of women. And so, Agnes, as the special envoy for the 2021 Food Systems Summit for the UN Secretary General, how do you see the role of women in terms of how you talked earlier about nutrition and the importance of nutrition? How do you see this linking up in terms of ensuring that we harness African gene banks?
Yeah, thank you. So though we talk about food systems, the starting statement with food systems is that food is culture. Unfortunately, one of the things that is under threat from a genetic perspective is the cultural part of food. because the part that is most attractive to people, the things that mean a lot to, say, different cultures in Africa, different societies in Africa, are those genes that they don't have the ability to conserve, but they know are extremely important. I did do research. My research was on bananas, and I was just amazed at how much each plant has a different name and how much it means to the communities that use that plant. And I thought that was in Africa, but I found the same thing in Indonesia, where I was following up to see where the bananas were coming from. I also noticed that this culture is being conserved by women. Every plant that I learned about in terms of its role in culture, every plant that I came to understand how it's being used in different parts of people's culture, it was really women that were explaining that to me. So in terms of understanding the genetic, without knowing that this is about genes, in terms of understanding the genetic potential of plants out there and the value of conserving that, I don't think there are anybody that understands that more than women. And that's probably because women are working every day with the farming systems, but also with these plants. So it's extremely important for them from a health perspective, from a nutrition perspective, and from a crop diversity perspective, and from a culture perspective. So from a food systems perspective, we have a lever that is about engaging women in the food systems and recognizing that there are crops that are being called women crops is extremely important. Millet, cowpeas in West Africa, beans in some parts of East Africa, those crops that people don't give a whole lot of value, but women value them because they are very important. The nutrition of their children and nutrition of their families are things that from a gene bank perspective, we must pay a lot of attention to and continue advancing. Yeah.
Thank you. I love what you said, because in a way, women's crops are critical to the growth of our children, and that will be critical to how the next generations really are able to thrive. And so the importance of women's crop and preserving that knowledge. And that you're talking also about the tacit knowledge that's held by communities. So Susan, I'd just like to follow up with you in terms of how communities and resources are essential to planetary health. Why does it matter? Are they really essential to planetary health? And how can food and nutrition security for all of us really depend? Why does it depend on?
Well, I think one way we can see how much we depend on it is if we look at global trends. So if we look at what's happening with hunger, we've had an uptick of hunger since 2017, I think was the first time in a decade. But we're also recognizing hidden hunger, which is affecting 2 billion or so people, which means you're not getting enough nutrients. And even more recently is the rise of obesity, where you also have over 2 billion people who are struggling with overweight and obesity. And it's also another form of malnutrition, and seeing nutrition not just as a lack of nutrients, but poor nutrition. And that can happen even when there's an overconsumption. And I think a lot of these things are driven by dietary simplification. And if diets are simplifying, and we're having a homogenization of the food supply, which is what I was sort of talking about before with trade rules, is homogenizing our food supply, then you see people getting sicker from what we eat as opposed to healthier from what we eat. So we know that smallholder farmers, so it all has to start with, if you're gonna have a diverse diet, it has to start by growing diverse, nutrient-dense foods. Now that's only the first step. I mean, there's access and affordability, there's so much more to it. But if it isn't being grown, it can't be the basis for a healthy food system. And a lot of our policies, trade policies, intellectual property policies, I think are driving us in another direction. And we know that these resources are very important in terms of having a diverse diet, but we also know that they're the foundation by which we adapt. So we adapt to climate change because we have the resources to breed with and innovate with in order to adapt. So the minute we start losing them, we lose our resilience of agricultural production. So whether it's nutrition or it's the resilience to stressors, climate stressors, other stressors, these are really fundamental resources. And they're fundamental in farmers' fields because those farmers are innovating in time, and they're on the front lines of climate change, on the front lines of a lot of risk factors, and they're innovating in that context. And they also need access to a broad array of genetic resources. And that's why it's important that we have community seed banks, we have our national and international gene banks, as well as making sure that we're encouraging and supporting and providing incentives for these smallholder farmers on farm so that we can keep our planet healthy and people healthy.
Thank you very much. You touched on a lot of things in terms of planetary health, the importance of biodiversity to really, prevent zoonosis. I was just thinking of the link between zoonosis and, COVID-19 and prevention of future pandemics, and how that ecosystem is not only important for human beings, but it's also important for wildlife and the thriving of wildlife. We're in a situation where biodiversity loss is being felt at a lot of levels. And as you said, the double burden of hunger, hidden hunger, and obesity are really critical to where we are in the world. And so one of the things that's really critical that we're going through is this really idea of the importance of conserving biodiversity. And so, Tony, if you could just give us some more information on your work in terms of biodiversity preservation in Africa and Asia, and how you see that importance of working with smallholder farmers and developing climate smart crops.
Great, thanks very much, Eliane. A fantastic question and a very complex and nuanced one. So biodiversity is this wonderful treasure that we have. Africa particularly has a large number of endemics, a large number of different habitats, biome systems that are threatened. Yes, we have the Congo forest, the third largest forest in the world. However, it is under threat, as well as the rest of the natural systems in the continent. Africa is the least forested country, the most rural continent, the most rural continent, and the poorest continent. But we need to focus on the positives as well. I mean, Martin Luther King didn't wake up one morning and say, and last night I had a nightmare. He had a dream. And so the dream of connecting biodiversity and the utility of it to functioning of ecosystems, to understanding its roles in people's livelihoods, and connecting it to reality is really important. We work on land use with land users. We work on land management, forested areas, looking at the agricultural ecosystem in its entirety, water use efficiency, etc. And what we're seeing is when we can link biodiversity measures to options for people, to solutions, to remedies, it breaks it outside of the biodiversity as purely a conservation endeavor or a research endeavor. Now, the OECD has set 3% of global GDP for research, European Union 2% of GDP for research, and African Union has set 1% target. Not a single country in Africa hits that on research. So we've got to make sure that gene banks and the work that we do on using biodiversity to make sure that it makes a difference, has impact, particularly with climate change, particularly with loss of habitat, reduction in forest area, to give that intergenerational treasure, the heritage that Agnes spoke about as well, to make sure that it's there. So how do we measure it? How do we monitor it at the intraspecific level, at the gene level, right up through species assemblages, to habitats, to biomes, is really important. And often we see that there's a lot of focus on indicator species, amphibians, birds, butterflies, ants. And yet what we see, because we know that 90% of terrestrial biodiversity is associated with forests and trees, that when we use trees as indicators of diversity, indicators of the functioning, the health, the vitality of those landscapes, it gives a real insight into, the wonderful hotspots that the continent has, but also the which receive a lot less attention, the biodiversity cold spots. How do we bring more diversity, that heterogeneity, to farming systems, to markets, to diets. And that connection, particularly if gene banks can break out of being a sub-department in agricultural research institutes and be connected to ministries of water and climate change and enterprise and environment, then we'll see a change. And as people see that connection and value and between biodiversity and their options, we will develop that as well. So let's use biodiversity to get Africa above that 1% research threshold to make sure that we're using the talent, the human minds, the human capital in Africa, along with its wonderful and bounteous natural capital to make sure that it can leapfrog ahead.
Thank you. That is very hopeful and ambitious and really necessary. So I just wanted to go back, Damaris, to you in terms of your work with the Templeton Pre-Breeding Project. How do you see gene banks' roles in promoting the use of their materials for pre-breeding of crop diversity, and why is it so crucial to global food security?
Thank you very much for that question. Just to mention, the current project that is funded by the Templeton through the Crop Trust covers covers Uganda, Tanzania, and Ethiopia, and it's also overlapping with a previous project that was funded by Crop Trust that was focusing on Kenya. Now, one of the main things that has happened within this project is that we've been able to get access to really precious material. Now, that material would not have been possible to access if they were not conserved. And as little as they may be at the moment, it is available and it's available for use. And so one of the ways that we can enhance the gene banks is to be able to provide perhaps more funding so that there's more conservation, and to be able to make available the conserved material for crop improvement. We have been able to also go out, since we realized that there was not enough material that was conserved, we were able also to make even more collections. And in the process, we were also able to work with farmers to be able to know exactly what they're looking for and what they're not able to find in the materials that they're working with. And resilience was one of the things that was highlighted in almost everywhere we went. Because of climate change, farmers are quite they are sensitive to that, and they don't want to lose crops, which they do almost on a yearly basis in this region. And so they're looking for something that would be durable. And we've had the opportunity to go back to the gene bank and look for drought tolerance. We've also been able to find resistance to biotic and other abiotic stresses. So it is important to ensure for gene banks to be well funded, to ensure that this kind of material is available. One thing that is notable is the fact that the national programs really are lacking in capacity and resources to be able to manage this. And the work that has been funded by Crop Trust has done much, but they would do even better if there was more funding that was provided by the national governments themselves. But I think the other thing that also needs to be done is to increase the awareness of the role of the gene banks locally. I think this is something that probably has been done mostly at the national, at the international level, and most international organizations would have gene banks, and people are aware of what they do, but the farmers are not yet aware of the exact role of the gene banks, and they probably do not even know yet that if they found something that was precious, they could deposit it at the gene bank, and that ensures that it will be available in the future. For finger millet, most of the farmers have maintained their precious varieties or land races within their homes, but you can imagine what happens when there's a fire or something happens or there's conflict. And so increasing awareness so that even to the farmer level, people know that gene banks exist for that particular reason is really, really important. But at the same time, the joint activities that are being done between breeders, gene bank and farmers would go a long way, because it's bringing in the application content into what is conserved. It's very possible for people to think, okay, we conserve the material. Yes, maybe in 30 years time when we need it, we can go back there. But I think more and more it's becoming clear that, you know, these are materials that are needed almost all the time. And every time that you want to increase diversity in the farmers' fields, if there's conserved material in the gene bank, you can always go back there and get it. So the best thing that the gene banks can do is always to make sure that that material is available for others to use, for the breeders to use, for the farmers to use, but also that it's maintained in the highest level of integrity to ensure that it's not compromised in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Susan, I'd just like to go back to you as the director of Seeds for All. Can you just tell us how supporting and expanding agroecology is critical today?
Yes, and I also work with Oxfam Novid's Sowing Diversity and Equals Harvesting Security. And both these organizations are very much committed to empowering smallholder farmers and expanding these agroecological approaches, of which agrobiodiversity is really important. And again, as I was speaking to last time, these resources are critical to nutrition, to health, to both human health and planetary health. And part of that is also looking at things that are the industrial agriculture and what it's done. That's again another reason we need agroecological approaches. They're very productive. They're adapted to local circumstances. Whereas we have industrial agriculture has been the greatest driver of biodiversity loss, greatest use of freshwater resources. So we know that system needs to be constrained, and agroecological approaches, which are socially appropriate and appropriate to the ecosystem there, need to be adopted. And again, looking just sort of at policies and the need, I think Tony spoke to this about public expenditure. We've seen a decrease of sort of public expenditure on research and development, on extension and support to smallholder farmers, and increasing privatization of these interests by mostly corporate interests that look for larger markets and an ability to pay. So again, we really need to support our public sector and policies that promote the public interest. And certainly when we're talking about on-farm or in situ or ex situ plant genetic resources for food and agriculture, that's both in the interest of smallholder farmers that are, again, out there on the front lines of climate change, and we're critical of when we see other stressors and to the resilience of these systems. But also, it's just they need the investment and the support and access to resources from our gene banks, from our governments. We just need to be doing better to support them in what they're doing. And the trends have been going in the opposite direction, but they are more productive systems because they're adapted to the local ecology. And also that kind of control is more likely to make sure that the health and nutrition of those communities is looked after as well. So thank you for that question.
Thank you, Susan. So Agnes, in terms of global perspective, what is your wish around promoting inclusive agriculture transformation for sustainable development in Africa?
So transforming food systems for sustainable agriculture is the anchor of the Food Systems Summit. We do recognize that food systems touch nearly all the 17 SDGs. So when the Food Systems Summit was launched, it was recognizing that it presents a huge opportunity. There's even scientific evidence on that. It presents a huge opportunity to use food systems for us to come through, and that there are a number of solutions that are already in our midst that we can tap into, including ensuring what we're talking about here, functional gene banks, because, and I call out specifically functional gene banks, because transforming our agriculture system has really been, so far, has been based on our ability to manage the environment, the gene system or the environment around the genes. Maybe we've gone a little bit too far, I might say. Maybe we've become a little bit overzealous in how we use those materials. But the Food System Summit also recognizes that we are getting outside our planetary boundaries, acceptable planetary boundaries, with regards to what we can do. And we are responsible for over 80% biodiversity losses coming from agricultural systems. So it really recognizing that, yes, we need to come through on critical issues that food systems can help us come through with regards to nutrition, to ending hunger, to advancing all sorts of things we need to advance. It's also contributing to obesity. Our food system is contributing to obesity, and food system is all the way from farm to fork. It's contributing to obesity. It's contributing to climate change, and for me, that's the only reason I'm in this, try to make sure that we actually help the world understand that our farmers who have nothing to do with climate change are suffering the most from climate change, as Damaris was saying. So really, the Food System Summit is about bringing back this level of awareness and this level of knowledge that we are impacting the world in unbelievable ways as human beings. We make decisions every day, 3 times a day probably, as we eat. We make decisions that influence what food is grown, how much water is used, which plant gets lost, which plant makes it to the table, which plant survives. All these are things that our food system is doing. And we designed the summit so that people everywhere, that's why we call it a People's Summit, so that people everywhere get an opportunity to know that there's actually something we can do about it. There's something we are doing wrong, and there's something we can do about correcting whatever we are doing and ensuring that we put our world back on track. So we've also designed it as a solution summit. So through action tracks, we are looking at whatever solutions they are out there, and we've taken it outside the confines of member states and UN, and really reached out to ensure that we are getting ideas from indigenous people. The biggest stewards of our environment are indigenous people and producers. We are getting ideas from them. We are getting ideas from fishers, from businesses, from SMEs and big businesses, from civil society, and everybody out there that is impacted by the food system as is. We are trying to make sure that they understand their place, but also their contribution comes forward. So as we come to the pre-summit, which is in July, last week of July, 26th to 28th, we hope that this is an opportunity where countries can actually step forward with boldness around what they have learned over the last 2 years of really trying to bring out the critical issues of the Food System Summit, and be able to make bold commitments around coming through on SDGs, but also around staying within our planetary boundaries, right? And those are the type of things also we'll be taking to the summit, which is in September, alongside the UN General Assembly. So my hope is that we build the level of awareness and consciousness and knowledge that is needed. We take responsibility as individuals, but also governments can put in place policy frameworks and put in place investments that can start moving things around.
Thank you. Thank you. So Tony, we've talked a lot about government involvement. Could you just talk about how you see the private sector also contributing to transformative and profitable change that is also helping us in terms of staying within planetary boundaries and combating climate change?
Great, thanks very much, Eliane. So that concept of public goods and private goods, we need to re-examine and set a new paradigm, because often, private goods are seen as public bads, and there's a conflict, and particularly in the agricultural space. But the real reward will be when we can see that combination of public good and private interest, when we can link those together to reinforce, to synergize those. We're doing a lot of work with a lot of multinational corporations who are interested and very serious about supply chain sustainability, about traceability, about thinking how they can connect their operations in a much more acceptable and with enlightened self-interest, because they face huge supply chain disruptions, huge regulatory and new policy burdens to account to. So we're not going to solve the problem through only a public angle or only a private angle. It's going to be bringing those together, and also through finance. Let's get private finance, innovative finance coming to support these schemes, because the opportunities for those, agriculture and landscape level investments is huge, and they're uncorrelated with a lot of the assets on most banks' balance sheets. I mean, we're talking about gene banks, so we may as well be talking about banks and finance. And, we have this idea of gene banks as like the safe deposit boxes at a bank. And a bank would never be profitable if it didn't have everything else running, its loan portfolio, the bond issues, and all of the working capital that keeps it going. So we need the private sector, the multinational corporations. We need the private sector as the SMEs. Extension systems are gone in Africa, with the exception of a few countries. It is the small-scale seed suppliers, nursery operators, input traders, and others that are the extension officers of the future. And they're the ones that will be connecting with farmers in economies. We can't live in an economy, less society, but the countries need to not just regulate and control private investment, but also to facilitate and to catalyze and to connect. And, there's a lot of private sector out there that wants to get engaged in African agriculture. And I think through investing in great opportunities in agriculture, through gene banks, through breeding, through new varieties, it'll be tremendous. Sadly, Africa spends $40 billion a year importing food that could be grown in Africa. $40 billion. I mean, if we use just 0.1% of that to fund gene banks and connect those with private sector, we would be making a greater surplus, reduce that import, substitute those imports in that cost and bill, and be much more prosperous for the farmers, for those communities, and the growing urban demand for these foods. And what will be, farmers can only eat what's available in supermarkets on the shelves. And so driving those market will be that combination and marriage and synergy between public and private interests.
Mm-hmm. So I think there's a good point there. How do we turn that 40 billion imports into local investment that allows thriving of local agro biodiversity and thriving of women's crops, of all the work we need to do to have a thriving continent that is climate mitigating and adapting. And so just in closing, we've talked for, this has been a really wonderful conversation. If you could just, in one sentence, each share a takeaway. I'll start with you, Damaris.
Thank you. My one thing that I'm really that has come up to me out of the work that I've done with the gene banks was that gene banks are going to be extremely critical, especially for underutilized crops or orphan crops. And this is because, a lot of investments have been focused on the major crops, and we are realizing relatively late that the other crops are also just as important and are likely to be even more important as we go into challenges of climate change and food and nutrition security. So it's really important that we actually go back to these underutilized crops and really understand the role of gene banks in promoting and maintaining and conserving this precious genetic material that will be definitely useful for our future generations. Thank you.
Thank you. Susan, one sentence.
Yes, I would say that a takeaway for me is that we need public policy that supports smallholder farmers and on-farm diversity. And we talk about free trade and free markets, but as Tony just described, there's an import dependency in Africa on imported food. That came about because of trade rules. So what we really need is to reform our public policy so that we're investing in these smallholder farmers in agrobiodiversity, in gene banks, on farmers' fields. That's what's important. And also to see the private sector is also the private actors, the smallholder farmers. They make large investments in what they do, even if it's only in labor. So I think we need to get more creative about how we use public policy to support the ends that we want. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Tony, one sentence, quick takeaway.
Intergenerational nature. Conservation is a long-term endeavor. Climate change is also long-term. We've got to connect those generations better. We talk about aging facilities, aging farmers, aging gene bank managers, aging panelists. And then so we come up with the arrogant solution of, well, it's got to be then capacity building. And it's incredibly arrogant because there's so much capacity in Africa. It's about capacity mobilization. The youth know farming, but they're not engaged in it. They don't see the advantage. So let's have incentives, triggers, new mechanisms, connections, work that fundamental that Crop Trust is doing, that African nations are doing, new policymakers are doing to get that capacity mobilization theme and paradigm working in Africa for intergenerational success.
Thank you, Tony. And Agnes, last words for us?
Thank you. We need to very generously safeguard the future of our planet and our environments, our agricultural production systems. Gene banks have a huge role to play in what the type of innovations we put forward in the future. And institutions like Crop Trust are doing a great job of helping us. But let's also not forget the women, the indigenous people, the producers that are on the ground every day helping us conserve these materials from what they know how to do best, and being able to really facilitate and make the linkage and ensure that we are reaching out in good time to save these materials is part of conserving for the future.
Thank you. Thank you all. This has been a great panel. Your passion for harnessing the power of gene banks is incredible. And I just wish everyone at this event to just continue enjoying their time. And thank you all for joining us for this panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that inspiring and passionate discussion. We now move to a lightning talk from Dr. Stefan Schmitz, Executive Director of the Global Crop Diversity Trust. Thank you again for joining this important conversation. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Be well. Over now to Stefan.
Hello, I'm Stefan Schmitz, Executive Director of the Global Crop Diversity Trust. Thank you all for joining us, and great thanks also to our expert panelists for participating so passionately in the important discussions held today. We are all aware of the immense challenges facing agriculture across the African continent and of the associated threats to food security for millions of people, often communities that are already vulnerable. And we are all aware of the urgent need to seek opportunities to overcome those challenges. As you have heard, the crop diversity stored in African gene banks is rich and offers great potential for the future of agriculture and food security in Africa, such as improved varieties of crops, resilient to climate change and other threats. But it is only by conserving seeds and supporting the gene banks, breeders and farmers that innovate we can ensure the food systems we will all need. The gene banks in Africa and worldwide are literally bursting with potential. And we must remember our resilience as a global community is interdependent. COVID-19 starkly demonstrated this. And everyone on Earth is interdependent when it comes to genetic resources. And if we are to succeed, there must be no more silos. A new way of thinking is required, a new paradigm for unprecedented times, one in which we all recognize our fundamental interdependence. And please, one that values the world's amazing diversity of seeds. Because without secure, robust food systems that builds on the diversity of our seeds, we are lost. Thank you, GLF, for providing this powerful platform for change. We truly are all connected. Be safe.